Hello team and welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan Ennis. It's a Ukraine War news update for the 4th of October 2023, so I'm a little bit later with this second part. Again, real life gets in the way, doesn't it? Okay, we're going to start with military aid and assistance to Ukraine and start with carrying on the conversation I was having the other night on the live stream, which was with Andrew Perpetua about the lack of artillery ammunition. And the idea is that the Ukrainian counteroffensive will last as long as they have ammunition to do it. You know, culmination is a case of running out, being exhausted in terms of troops, energy, resources, ammunition, supplies, so on and so forth, until you kind of regenerate and go again. It's not that necessarily you've been beaten into submission. It's not the case that you have lost in any kind of military way. It's just like you've run out of the ability to carry on. And the Ukrainians will last as long as their supplies last, which is really as long as their ammunition lasts in terms of artillery and mortar. That is absolutely crucial for them. There's been a lack of that right throughout the war. They've been operating at a ratio that is, what was it? It was sort of, some would argue, 10-1 Russian to Ukrainian artillery firing ratio, maybe even more at certain points. There were some claims that Ukrainians were firing, 5,000 a day. The Russians were claimed to have been firing 60,000 a day at one point. So the huge disparity there between the capacity to the ammunition capacity. Now, there are claims now turning up today from NATO that the Ukrainians can see the bottom of the barrel. We'll come to that in a second. Here's Rob Lee, Michael Kaufman saying that they both wrote in December that ammunition availability, particularly artillery ammunition, might be the single most important factor that determines the course of the war in 2023. I think that would likely be true for 2024 as well. Absolutely agree with that. But they will only be able to go as far as they can now with with regard to artillery ammunition, but then in 2024, even when they restock, that will only allow them to go as far as those stocks go. And so therefore it's about a sustainable provision of artillery, which is why the EU, why the US, why allies right across the world, from Australia to the UK, are ramping up artillery production to help Ukraine, and also to backfill their own stocks that have been depleted by, giving assistance to Ukraine. It takes a long time to ramp up those production levels. It also depends on the amount of explosives that are available to those manufacturers as well, and there might be a bottleneck in terms of explosives, natural resources that are required for making those. So lots involved in that, and the Russians have been able to rely on having massive stocks of ammunition that are decades and decades old. Well, actually, it appears that they are struggling somewhat. They are going to North Korea, to Iran, and to these other places to try and get themselves ammunition. So this is a problem for both sides. NATO, as I say today, said the bottom of the barrel is now visible. The official said, we need the industry to ramp up production in a much higher tempo. Well, the US are looking, and they are on track to, I think they're now up to about 1,000 rounds a day. They're around about, they were sort of 28,000 rounds a month, artillery ammunition pieces, rounds a month. Shells, that's the word I was looking for. And they are hoping to get to 80,000 shells by the end of next year. That would be really useful. Obviously, it's going to be critical to get players like South Korea, who have, as far as I understand it, started backfilling the US stocks, although there's an agreement that you can't use South Korean artillery shells in Ukraine. They can't directly supply them. But given that North Korea are now known to be supplying Russia, I think this might push South Korea into saying, do you know what, sod it. Yeah, you can have South Korean weaponry, South Korean artillery shells. That would be incredibly important, because South Korea have got a burgeoning military export industry, but they also have huge stocks, given that they have been at war for as long as they have been. So yeah, it's all about artillery, and NATO are saying, yeah, it's not looking good for Ukraine. Well, really for both sides. It's but everyone knows this, and everyone is ramping up artillery ammunition. There will be a new US military aid package for Ukraine this week. Bloomberg's reported Biden is yet to agree to sending ATACMS. Reporter was asked, will the new upcoming aid package for Ukraine include ATACMS? And a Department of Defense spokesperson said, quote, I don't have any news on ATACMS for today, thanks. Although that's completely normal. When any new bit of equipment has been offered, they say, we've got no news about that, we've got no news about that. And then they make the announcements like, and now we're given this. It's like, so they know perfectly well when ATACMS are going to be given, I assume. And it may or may not be announced in this package, but you won't get hint of that beforehand. I really hope that ATACMS are given. Now, a lot of people saying, or some people are saying, ATACMS ain't all that in a bag of chips. They're not going to be that useful. Possibly they might have too much of an aerial footprint, so to speak. And that means that they could be shot down fairly easily. That's yet to be seen. I would like Ukraine to test out whether they'll be useful or not. Give them a good haul of these missiles and say, yeah, see if they're useful. They might get shot down. Some might get through. I just think that specifically the cluster variant of these will be useful for the Ukrainians. Right. Foreign Minister Elena Valtonen announced the preparation of a new package of military aid to Ukraine. In total, according to Valtonen, Finland allocated 2 billion euros to Ukraine. That is pretty cool. So Finland has contributed almost 2 billion euros to Ukraine. Our next defense material package is under preparation. Ukraine is our largest development partner. Finland and the EU will support Ukraine as long as it's needed. Freedom will prevail. Many thanks to hosting us in Kyiv. Now, this is obviously the usefulness of the foreign ministers meeting Kyiv, and that allows those personal relationships to be forged, and it allows things to be achieved, very concrete things to be achieved, as you can see there. Now, Ukraine was under a lot of pressure in terms of its energy infrastructure last autumn and winter, where waves of cruise missiles and Shahed drones were sent into Ukraine. We have not seen the likes since in terms of the number of missiles and drones. And in fact, I've got an extra segment to do on that. The numbers were at their peak last year, and we haven't seen it since. And that has brought about theories that stockpiles for the Russians in terms of cruise missiles are running low and have been for some time. They still make them, but they can't replace them at the rates that they were using them back then. So you had at some point like 130, I think, might be the record of aerial munitions sent across into Ukraine, and now you're looking at sort of 40 being the top that they seem to send at the moment. That is obviously considerably less. Considerably fewer cruise missiles and Shahed drones are sent at any one time, and possibly also going more towards the drones than the cruise missiles. So the numbers of drones being sent over is still fairly high, but the cruise missiles is the one that's dropped down. So Ukraine, anyway, with regard to that, Ukraine keeps some transformer stocks abroad in anticipation of possible Russian shelling, according to The Economist. So 100 new high-voltage transformers have been ordered, half of which will be produced domestically and half produced abroad, the newspaper adds. The Economist writes that the foreign transformers will be stored in Poland and Romania until they are needed. That's really important because these are NATO nations. They won't be targeted, and they can store what Ukraine needs, and Ukraine can dip into them when they're needed, rather than keep them in Ukraine and those being bona fide targets for the Russians. Right. The Swiss company Global Clearance Solutions handed over the first of the 4 GCS 200 demining machines ordered. We know that is it 100 million Swiss francs the Swiss have said that they are given for humanitarian demining needs. I presume this is part of that package. That's going to be really useful. They look like they are remotely controlled vehicles. They look pretty cool, and yeah, good stuff to get those into Ukraine. Right, Antonov, so that's the air manufacturer, the airplane manufacturer that produces those massive cargo planes, has agreed with a French company, Turgis Gaillard, on the production of the Arok Mal UAV in Ukraine. So the agreement was concluded last week during a visit of French Defense Minister Sébastien Lecornu to Kiev. Now, as I understand it, this will be a cheaper variant of this Mal drone that will be constructed within Ukraine, and that is really good. It's good to get foreign involvement, foreign investment. It means there's a sustainable production of equipment that Ukraine really need. The question, as ever with these announcements, is how soon can a completed one of these get in the air? You know? So yeah, some criticism here of Antonov, but some saying that it's really good news, so on and so forth. Right. Here we have the Ukrainians training at a US Army base in Germany. Quite a lot of equipment. I was wondering from this kind of footage whether this equipment is Ukrainian equipment or equipment they're just training on. Will it ever see the front line, or is this sort of stuff in another country that they can't eventually tap into? But of course, if they use it, then they'll need something else to train on. The training is a continual process. So anyway, good news that training continues for the Ukrainians. Terje Ozerberg, one of my viewers, was talking about how there should be reservists just trained up in Ukraine. Young reservists should be trained up, 10,000 at a time, training them. You don't have to send them to the front line. You just train them up and then send them back to their jobs, and then they get kind of refresher training once every 2 months or something. And then when they're needed, there's your you can tap into that mobilization. It's ready there for you. I thought that's a pretty good idea, something like that. Anyway, two types of counter drone jammers for the Ukrainians. The devices are designed for installation on vehicles. I've seen similar things that are turning up on the front line on Russian tanks. These are sort of electronic warfare jamming bits of kit. You'd attach them to vehicles, and that would obviously, would hopefully protect them from being hit by things like first-person view drones. There are new drones coming online. I know the Ukrainians are bringing online drones that, if the GPS was jammed, they still had inertial guidance that could get them to the target last minute, and that those sort of drones would be very difficult, I think, to properly electronically jam. Right, this is pretty amazing. Ukrainians have created an invisibility cloak for the Ukrainian army, according to the Minister of Digital Transformation Fedorov. The cloak blocks the radiation of heat and makes the fighters invisible to the enemy through wearing images and drones with thermal imaging cameras. It weighs up to 2.5 kilograms. I hear as well it's like fully waterproof, heat, like good in the cold. These are pretty clever bits of kit by the looks of it. We saw the optic invisibility shield that's designed by the British, although that still be at the prototype stage. This appears to be something that the Ukrainians can use. You can imagine snipers finding this particularly useful for themselves, and obviously, it's particularly useful for being protected from snipers. So yeah, that's a pretty cool bit of kit. Pretty cool. That's a bit of a pun there, because they are indeed thermal blankets. Pew, cool. Anyway, that's what it looks like in reality. Yeah. So Hungary has offered, that's very kind of them, I think that's the wrong word. Hungary have suggested reducing the EU aid package for Ukraine. I talked about this I was throwing around millions and then billions and then millions. I forgot how much. Here it suggests it's 50 billion euros that they're waiting for. So Orban's government has proposed halving the European Union's proposed 50 billion euro package for Ukraine. Now Hungary were attaching contingencies to the assistance, to that amount of money going out, and they wanted the release of OTP Bank from a blacklist. They wanted X, Y, and Z. There's a lot of political shenanigans and negotiation going on concerning that. Of course, Ukraine could really do with that money, so they have indeed compromised, from what I can gather. Right. A Russian tank, so we're on to a few Russian bits and pieces. A Russian tank with French equipment was taken as a trophy by the 15th Brigade of the National Guard during the Zaporizhia counteroffensive. This tank is of the 2022 modification, so it's really very recent, is equipped with elements of gunner's equipment manufactured by the French company Thales. The question is how the French company's sub-sanctioned equipment ended up in a newly modified Russian tank. So there are some questions to be answered here. How are sanctions being evaded? This is really high value military electronic equipment you'd think is obviously sanctioned. Ends up in a 2022 upgraded Russian or manufactured Russian tank. Right. ISW is reporting that Iran may soon conclude an agreement with Russia on the transfer of missiles. This is really worrying for me. So you've seen how problematic Shaheeds have been for Ukraine. Well, there's long been touted this idea that the Iranians are making pretty cheap and half-decent cruise missiles that Russia are very interested in. This could happen after October the 18th, the end of the UN Security Council Resolution 2231, which bars Iran from supplying other countries with ballistic missiles. Analysts at the Institute for the Study of War said. So I did report this the other day, but it is being talked about still. That security resolution really be very useful if that maintained. Russia wants the Fateh 110 and Zolfagar ballistic missiles, both of which have a range of 300 kilometers or more. Zelensky has denied rumors of Iranian missile deliveries to Russia, saying, quote, "At the moment, there are no facts of Iran selling missiles to Russia. Our services are in contact with our partners and are dealing with this issue." I'm sure it's going to be at the top of Ukrainian agendas, this. So even though he might be claiming that, hey, there's no problem here, there might well be a problem under the radar, so to speak. The Fateh 110 is a short-range, road-mobile, solid propellant ballistic missile. It uses single-stage solid propellant engine and has a range of 210 kilometers. So that sounds short range, but that's long enough range for what the Russians might want it for. And the Fateh 110 first generation has 200 kilometers, second generation 250 kilometers, third and fourth generation 300 kilometers. Thinking, goodness me, if they get hold of that, what is the delay to ATACMS and other such missiles from NATO forces? Right. Now, with regard to Russian military aid in the sense of, mobilization, Shoigu, the defense minister, says he is satisfied with the amount of fresh human resource, says Dmitry from War Translated, at his disposal, and more are coming every month voluntarily. This is not surprising, as a country that can offer a salary of $300 per month on average has heaps of desperate people who are ready to kill and die to feed their families. Having said that, he could have pulled this number out of his bottom anyway. Nice. But don't be fooled thinking the mobilization is not coming. It definitely is on the cards. I believe, he says, it would have already happened if it wasn't for Prigozhin's March of Justice, which scared the Kremlin loony scared them a lot. With the so-called presidential campaign, i.e. fake elections, which is sort of imminent, as 23 years is not enough for the Tsar on the way, the last thing they want now is discontent among the populace. In other words, they're just about to have elections. Yes, they are completely sham elections, but he doesn't want public discontent to mess around with that. So you would imagine any announcement of mobilization might take place after those elections. Right. So much geopolitical stuff going on. Goodness me. I'll try and make this quick, but right. We're going to go back to America. We're going to go to Kevin McCarthy, who was the House Majority Speaker, the House of Representatives, for the Republicans, who have not a massive majority, a kind of slim majority in the House of Representatives. Now, Kevin McCarthy, when he became Speaker again, had to go through 15 rounds of voting before he got in, and he was having to do compromises with the hard right in his own party in order to get that position. In particular, people like Matt Gaetz, who is Matt Gaetz himself is a bit of an issue. So, as even the Daily Mail online says, Matt Gaetz furiously denies moving against Kevin McCarthy for not stopping ethics investigation into him over illicit drug use, sexual misconduct. So there's sex trafficking accusations against Matt Gaetz. He's not I despise Matt Gaetz. He's not a nice human being, and misuse of campaign funds. So he is not only, in my opinion, not a nice person, but he's also on the receiving end of a lot of allegations. And there's accusations afloat that his move against Kevin McCarthy, and I explain what's happened and why it's important for Ukraine, might be fueled by the fact that there is a continuing ethics investigation into him. Nonetheless, we have this situation where the Republican Kevin McCarthy is no longer the speaker, having been ousted in a 216 to 210 vote. This marks the first time ever a Speaker of the House has been removed by a vote in US history. Nothing will be passed in Congress without a new Speaker elected. Right, so you need a new Speaker before anything can be passed, and that includes aid to Ukraine. So he was ousted. Some Republican leaders condemned McCarthy's removal, with former Vice President and current presidential candidate Mike Pence suggesting it would undermine the GOP in the eyes of the voters. Quote, "Chaos is never America's strength, and it's never a friend of American families that are struggling," Pence said in an event in Georgetown. Former Speaker of the House, Newt Gingrich, dubbed Gaetz an anti-Republican and called him actively destructive to the conservative movement, urging Republicans to vote to expel Gaetz from the House of Republican Conference. Right. Okay. So on and so forth. There's lots more to say here. Former Speaker Kevin McCarthy, though, did place a larger share of his blame for the intra-Republican battle on the opposing party, saying, "I think today was a political decision by the Democrats." We'll come to that, because I think this is pretty fascinating. Right, Kevin McCarthy voted out as Speaker of the House, first removal in congressional history. It was a stunning moment for the battle-tested McCarthy, a punishment fueled by growing grievances but sparked by his weekend decision to work with Democrats to keep the federal government open rather than risk a shutdown. So the government was going to shut down. This would put all sorts of people into furlough. It would certainly mean that aid to Ukraine would not be, finalized. So on, and there's still that issue, because what happened is he separated the aid to Ukraine bill out to then get the budget passed through, so the government didn't shut down. Now, an earlier vote was 218 against tabling the motion, with 11 Republicans allowing it to advance. The House then opened a floor debate unseen in modern times ahead of the next round of voting. Now, I heard somewhere that floor tabling could only take place because of a concession he had made in the 15-round vote to get him as speaker to Matt Gaetz. So I think Matt Gaetz was able to table that due to an earlier concession. Correct me if I'm wrong. I may be wrong on that. Anyway, the House then opened a floor debate unseen in modern time ahead of the next round of voting. McCarthy of California insisted he would not cut a deal with Democrats to remain in power. They refused to do a deal with the Democrats. And bear in mind, Democrats have almost half the votes here, because it's put to all of them to vote whether he should stay. Not that he could have relied on their help even if he had asked. Democratic leader Hakeem Jeffries said in a letter to colleagues that he wants to work with Republicans, but he was unwilling to provide the votes needed to save McCarthy. It's now the responsibility of the GOP members to end the House Republican civil war, Jeffries said, announcing the Democratic leadership would vote for the motion to oust the Speaker. So if all Republicans voted to keep McCarthy as Speaker, he would have remained Speaker. But there's this element of rebels that together, if then the Democrats voted against McCarthy, that would vote McCarthy out. And that's what happened. There were a small bunch of rebels and the Democrats. Now, the Democrats, you can argue, were they politically gaming this? And you wouldn't blame them. The Republicans would have done the same. But also, the Democrats hate Kevin McCarthy. Kevin McCarthy has riled the Democrats time and time again and has not worked across the aisle. Yes, he did here, but there's a lot of form McCarthy has with the Democrats. So he's not got a lot of friends there. So whether they are just gaming this so that there's just chaos in the Republican Party, or whether it's genuinely because they don't like McCarthy, it's probably both. So Hakeem Jeffries said it's a responsibility of the Republicans to sort out their own mess, and they didn't, because I think, what was it, 11 of them voted, or no, 8 of them voted against McCarthy. So as the House fell silent, Gaetz, a top ally of Donald Trump, rose to offer his motion. Gaetz is a leader of the hard-right Republicans who fought in January against McCarthy in his prolonged battle to gain the gavel. It's a sad day, Republican Representative Tom Cole of Oklahoma said as the debate got underway, urging his colleagues not to plunge the House Republican majority into chaos. Now, just finally, McCarthy received 3 standing ovations during his private meeting. So when he went and met people, both Democrats and Republicans, but he met the Republicans privately, they actually, gave him a standing ovation. He's generally quite popular with a lot of them. One when he came to the microphone to speak, again during his remarks, and finally when he was done. According to a Republican at the meeting who was granted anonymity to discuss it, at one point there was a show of hands to support McCarthy, and it was overwhelming, said Representative Ralph Norman, from South Carolina, a member of the House Freedom Caucus. So Republicans were upset that McCarthy relied on Democratic votes on Saturday to approve the temporary measure to keep the government running until the 17th. November the 17th, some would have preferred a government shutdown as they fight for deeper spending cuts. Some Republicans wanted the government to shut down so they could force through spending cuts. But Democrats were also upset with McCarthy for walking away from the debt deal that he made with Biden earlier this year that already set federal spending levels as he emboldened his right flank to push the steep spending reductions. Okay, so what is going on? This is how it pertains to Ukraine. So in Sunday, remarks responding to the thwarted government shutdown, this is coming from CNN, President Joe Biden called on McCarthy and other Republican leaders to follow through the commitment to hold a standalone vote on funding for Ukraine as it attempts to fight off Russia's invasion. Quote, I hope my friends on the other side keep their word about support for Ukraine. They said they're going to support Ukraine in a separate vote, Biden said. We cannot under any circumstance allow American support for Ukraine to be interrupted. When a reporter asked whether Biden on Sunday would trust McCarthy with the next deal when the next deal comes around, Biden responded, we just made one about Ukraine, so we'll find out. McCarthy denied he had made any side deals on promising to put Ukraine funding on the floor, adding that all he did was tell Democrats that if there was a technical issue with the legislation to continue government funding that dealt with transferring existing funds, it could be fixed. Quote, there is no side deal, so I don't know who is bringing that up, McCarthy told reporters in the Capitol. There is no side deal on Ukraine. White House Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre repeatedly would not specify any details beyond what Biden had said publicly over the weekend. Quote, there's obviously bipartisan support to continue the funding to Ukraine, she said, when asked about whether Biden was referring to any specific agreement from McCarthy to take up new Ukraine funding. And then, there's lots more to be said about this. I've probably spoken too long on this. I mean, the Guardian talks about how, NATO is saying that there's bottom of the barrel, as I've said, is showing, and they need to get stuff to Ukraine. So it's a really vital time. A Ukraine political group called Defending Democracy Together, a political group. It's not a Ukraine political group. It's a American political group. Defending Democracy Together has put a Ukraine report card together, voting people who might replace McCarthy on ratings from A to F. And there are some who are like B. There's one who's A, Tom Emmer, who's a House Republican whip. He got the highest rating. But there are a lot who are Fs as well. And that would be much worse than the B minus that they had already given McCarthy. So McCarthy was like average on Ukraine. There are others that are much worse on Ukraine that could be made speakers. So there's a lot resting on who replaces Kevin McCarthy as to what support Ukraine can expect to continue receiving. Washington has sent the Kiev government $113 billion in security, economic, and humanitarian aid since the start of the war. Leaders in the Senate, which is narrowly controlled by the Democrats, have promised to take up legislation in the coming weeks to ensure continued U.S. security and economic support for Ukraine. So the Senate, where you've got 100 senators with a narrow majority for the Democrats, is broadly bipartisan. Broadly has bipartisan support for Ukraine. In the House, where it's a slight majority for the Republicans, of those Republicans, like 200 and however many it is, about half of those voted against Ukraine aid recently. So that tells you where that there is a big difference between the House and the Senate. Right. Anyway, hopefully that's explained that to you. Correct me if I've got any of that wrong. Americans will probably tell me to keep my nose out of US politics, but it's all right to keep my nose into other countries' politics. So, no, I'm joking, not joking. Attention, Poland, Finland, Baltic states. So this is Anton Geraschenko pointing out some of the rhetoric coming out of Russia. So-called head of Zaporizhia region. So this is a politician in charge of an annexed region of Ukraine, Yevgeny Balitsky, discusses his plans to return the subjects of the Russian Federation with the quote force of Russian weapons. This is absolutely incredible, and this is where you have to listen other those Americans or Europeans who are anti-aid to Ukraine. This is what a genuine Russian politician, administrative official is saying. The Russian Empire, when it staggered after the Bolshevik coup, the October Revolution, and took he says, different path of development, lost a lot of its subjects. I'm not talking about lands now, that goes without saying. Warsaw, Helsinki, Revel, Liepaja, and the Baltics, these are all our lands and our people live there, he says. We have to correct it, and now that they have been made a wordless herd, trembling creatures, and we will change it by force of Russian arms. I do not believe in any diplomacy in this case. He is advocating invading the Baltics. Perhaps diplomacy should always exist, but I believe that we can get it back only with the power of the Russian arms to return our people, our subjects of the Russian Empire then, and of the Russian Federation now, so that the whole world does not turn into Sodom and Gomorrah, which is currently taking place in Europe. It's so important that you might think this is some fringe nut job, but this is a Russian administrative official, a politician, in charge of a whole Russian territory, as according to the Russians, an annexed Ukrainian territory, as according to everyone else, advocating invading former Soviet parts of the Soviet Empire, if you like, the Soviet Union, Poland, the Baltics, Finland, literally saying those countries should be invaded and diplomacy is off the cards. They should be invaded by force with arms. Lithuania has opened a corridor for the transit of Ukrainian grain to the ports of the Baltic states. It was announced by Lithuanian Foreign Minister Gabrielius Landsbergis. So that's really good that if you can't get grain out via the Black Sea, although they are trying to do that, 3 ports are now actively taking ships and they're hugging the coast all the way out to the Bosphorus Straits into the Mediterranean. But there's now another option out by the Baltics via the Baltic Sea and out into the North Sea, so on and so forth. That will give another option. You know, you've got the Danube, you've got land routes to get to the Baltics, you've got all these options for grain to get out of Ukraine, and hopefully together it means that the world can be supplied with food. Right, remaining with the Baltics, and this is not so great, an international consortium of journalists has analysed close to 300 Estonian-registered crypto companies and discovered dozens of crimes, massive scale fraud, money laundering, sanctions and evasion, and illicit financing of organisations such as the Wagner Group. This is really bad. However, I don't know that they are particularly Estonian companies. They're crypto companies, or they're registered, but where are they, who are they, shell companies, all this kind of stuff. This could be a way of tightening the loopholes, tightening the grip on sanctions around Russia if stuff like this can be thrown into the public eye. Now, in terms of the Russian economy, the ruble has been tanking. It's over 100 against the US dollar. It's also, I believe, tanking against the Ukrainian hryvnia, which is kind of interesting. Billions from the Russian budget is going into into defending the 100 level on the ruble. Interest rates tripled from a year ago, all to no avail. Now, if you want to see what Russia, or understand what Russia did to prop up the ruble and how it's connected to interest rates, or maybe not, how there's weird things going on with all sorts of Russian facts and figures, Joe Blogs is a really good site to give you a great understanding of that. He's almost doing stuff on a daily basis on the Russian ruble. I mean, I'm sure I've watched like 3 videos in the last week on the Russian ruble and what's going on. He did one yesterday. Russian ruble collapses to record low as economy crashes, fuel export ban continues, and inflation goes up. Inflation's been a weird one because it was at massive level and then it dropped to virtually nothing. You're like, what's going on there? And then it's been creeping up and then trend is upwards. But they're doing things as if inflation's a real problem that you would expect if it's a real problem. But it's only at like 5%, 5.2% or something like that. So there's a lot of fudging the figures and doing things to artificially inflate things or dampen other things. So the Russians are doing everything they can to make sure their economy still functions, but at what cost? And their reserves are likely being exhausted. Anyway, go and check out that Joe Blogs video and all the ones he does. Good stuff. Top news today, part 1 from Max23. Right, I just want to dip into something he says. Which one was it? I can't remember now. All of these I've gone through. Russia may test nuclear weapons in the Arctic soon. That was something that was a little bit dodgy. I'm sure there's one extra. Yeah, it might be the 3 Black Sea ports there resume receiving ships, and I've just told you that. Interesting one. Joseph Borrell from the EU. The EU plans to train 40,000 Ukrainian soldiers in the coming months. That would be super useful indeed. Anyway, moving on. European Parliament has approved the revision of the EU budget for 2021 to 27, which includes provisions on the creation of a special Ukrainian fund on 50 billion euros. The decision was approved with 393 votes in favour, 136 against and 92 abstentions. I wonder what the trend line has been for pro-Ukrainian voting in the EU and whether we have seen fewer votes for pro-EU as, say, there's a growing movement in the EU of nations like Slovakia with Robert Fico getting in charge and so on and so forth, or whether that stayed fairly consistent. I don't know if anyone can let me know where the trend lines go with that, and how bad is 393 to 136. That looks fairly healthy still in terms of pro-Ukrainian support within Europe. So good stuff there, I guess. EU Council President Charles Michel supports Ukraine's accession to the EU by 2030. That sounds like a long way off, but actually that's, that is chivying it along fairly nicely considering how many hoops nations have to jump through. I mean, there have been nations that have been waiting to get into the EU for longer than that, right? He told Spiegel in an interview that he demanded that the EU speed up decision-making processes. At the same time, he emphasised there would be no political discounts, neither for Ukraine nor for the other EU accession candidates. So you also don't want to annoy countries that have been waiting longer than Ukraine, but if Ukraine gets to leapfrog over them just because of kind of political will rather than actually achieving milestones, that might annoy people. And finally, H&M has reopened stores in Ukraine, so this is great, getting Ukraine back on its feet and operating as a functioning economy. The brand will open 6 stores by the end of November, beginning with December in the Kiev shopping centres and in Lviv. Obviously, this is quite important. It's not just, oh, that's nice, but actually these guys would be doing risk assessments. Okay, they're not going to be investing in Kiev if they think that we've seen shopping malls get hammered in missile attacks in Kyiv, right, over the course of the war. What this tells you is that H&M, like insurers and risk managers, are happy enough that the air defense systems are in place in Kyiv to keep them safe. So actually, a piece of news like this can tell you much more than what you think it might on face value. That is good news going forward. If you've got corporations saying, yeah, we'll put a new shop in or reopen old stores or whatever in Kiev and in Lviv, that means they are fairly confident that those are safe places to operate. And that means that the air defences are good. Right, on the other hand, BBC reporting that Burger King is still open as usual in Russia. Burger King, quote, remains open as usual in Russia despite the US fast food chain claiming at the start of the full-scale invasion of Ukraine that it would exit the country. Burger King is a subsidiary of the Canadian-American multinational company Restaurant Brands International, RBI, which owns a 15% stake in Burger King's franchise business in Russia. I mean, it does get difficult when you get franchises because you say, right, you need to close, and then they say, no, we're not going to do that. And then it's like legal wranglings in how to achieve that. So yeah, that's the situation. Anyway, thanks for watching. That's an awful lot of content again. Stuff just keeps happening. There's so much in the news at the moment. You please watch me on 1.5 times speed. I'm so much better. And my ums and ahs, just you glide over them like a pro ice skater over an Olympic ice rink. Anyway, take care. Speak soon.